August 18, 1944. In the thick jungle of New Britain, Private First Class Kenji Watanabe crouched beneath a fallen tree. The rain had turned everything into mud. His uniform clung to his body, heavy and cold. His rifle, once a symbol of duty, felt like a stone he no longer had strength to lift. For 6 weeks, his unit had been cut off from the rest of the Japanese army. No supply drops, no contact, no hope. They lived on whatever the jungle offered: bitter roots, insects, half-rotten leaves. Some made them sick. Others gave just enough strength to stay alive for one more day. 3 men had already died that week quietly without ceremony, their bodies giving up before their minds could. The jungle did not mourn them. It simply swallowed them whole. Watanabe was no hero. None of them were now. They were ghosts wearing uniforms, clinging to rifles that no longer mattered. He could barely feel his fingers as he rubbed the mud from his face, trying to focus on the distant sound that didn't belong to the forest. Voices, human voices, not Japanese. They were calling through the trees, broken but understandable. Surrender. You will not be harmed. The words froze the 8 surviving men. Surrender. The word itself carried poison. Every soldier in the Imperial Army had been taught what that meant. Capture was worse than death. Americans, they'd been told, tortured prisoners, mutilated them, humiliated them until they begged to die. Death in battle, that was the honorable end. Anything else was shame eternal. But there was no battle left to fight. No ammunition, no strength, no food. The men exchanged silent glances, faces, sunken eyes, hollow. They were dying already, slowly, painfully. In that suffocating silence, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, the highest-ranking man, still breathing, finally whispered the unthinkable. "We surrender." The words hung in the air like a confession. "If they kill us," he said softly, "we die quickly. If we stay here, we die slowly. There is no third option." It was not courage that pushed them forward. It was exhaustion. On trembling hands and knees, they crawled from the undergrowth, weapons dropped, hands raised. Their bodies were too weak for fear, their eyes too empty for pride. The jungle that had hidden them now watched them step out toward whatever came next, death, captivity, or something no one could yet imagine. The rain had eased, but the jungle air was thick with tension and rot. Every sound, the drip of water, the buzz of flies, the crack of a twig felt like a warning. Watanabe's heart pounded as he and the others crawled out from the shadows. They moved like ghosts. Their hands raised weapons left behind in the mud. Each motion was deliberate, fragile, a mixture of fear and surrender. They had been trained their entire lives for the opposite. Since basic training, every Japanese soldier had heard the same lesson repeated until it carved itself into their bones, never be taken alive. Capture meant disgrace. It meant your family would bear your shame. It meant torture, mutilation, humiliation beyond imagination. But what was left to defend? Their stomachs were hollow. Their muscles burned from hunger. Their minds were numb from weeks of watching comrades die one by one, not from bullets, but from nothingness. Sergeant Yamamoto led the way. His once crisp uniform was torn to rags, his sword long abandoned. He kept his eyes forward, not daring to look back at the others. Watanabe followed close behind every step, a battle against his own body. They expected gunfire. They expected pain. They expected to fall face first into the dirt and never rise again. As the first leaves parted and the clearing opened before them, Watanabe saw the silhouettes American Marines standing in loose formation, rifles at their sides. The sunlight glinted off metal helmets, and for a moment he thought it was the afterlife. No one fired. The Americans didn't shout. They didn't charge forward or sneer. They just watched, calm, alert, but not angry. One of them, a voice from somewhere near the front, spoke in clear, steady English. "It's okay. Nobody's going to hurt you." Watanabe didn't believe it. He couldn't. It had to be a trick, a cruel prelude to execution. He shut his eyes, bracing for the burst of gunfire that would end it. But the jungle stayed quiet. Only the hum of insects filled the silence. When he finally opened his eyes again, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Something almost human. A U.S. medic was walking toward him slowly, his weapon slung behind his back. In his hand, he carried a canteen. He knelt down, his voice awkward but gentle. "Water. Drink slowly." Watanabe hesitated, then reached out with shaking hands. The water was cold, clean alive. It slid down his throat like medicine. In that moment, the war, everything he thought he knew about it, began to crumble. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the rasp of breathing, the faint clink of canteens, the rustle of jungle leaves. 8 Japanese soldiers, starved, trembling, half-dead, waited for the gunfire that never came. Private Watanabe kept his eyes on the ground. He was sure the kindness was a setup, some twisted performance before execution. That's what the propaganda had warned about. The Americans would trick you, make you hope, then torture you until you wished for death. But the torture never started. Instead, another American soldier knelt beside him, checking his pulse, examining his arms, his neck. His touch was careful, almost clinical. No hatred in it, just routine concern, as if Watanabe were one of their own. Nearby, a Marine radioed for medical supplies. Another handed out blankets. Weapons stayed lowered. Every gesture contradicted everything the Japanese had been told to expect. Then came the moment that shattered them completely. An officer, young, confident, his voice calm, spoke through an interpreter. "You're prisoners of war now. You're protected under international law. No one will harm you. We're going to give you hot food and medical treatment." Hot food. Watanabe blinked, unable to process the words. He had forgotten what that even meant. Within the hour, the 8 prisoners were sitting near an American field kitchen. In front of each man sat a tin plate piled with rice, canned beef bread, and steaming coffee. The smell alone was enough to make them dizzy. They ate slowly, cautiously, like men expecting poison. Their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle much, but their eyes couldn't stop staring. The Americans didn't laugh. They didn't mock. They just made sure the men had water, that no one choked, that each had a blanket against the evening chill. To the Japanese soldiers, it made no sense. They had been told that surrender meant starvation, that capture meant humiliation, that Americans had no honor. No. Yet here they were, fed, clothed, cared for, alive. Watanabe looked at the steam rising from his tin cup, the warmth spreading through his chest, and felt something he hadn't known since before the war. Confusion, hope, humanity. He thought of everything he'd been told, the horror stories drilled into him in training, the images of American demons painted in military pamphlets. And now he was sitting among those same demons, sharing food that tasted like forgiveness. He didn't yet understand it, but something fundamental inside him had begun to shift. What if everything they had been told was a lie? What if mercy was real even from the enemy? That first meal was more than food, it was a revelation. Watanabe and his comrades sat in stunned silence, chewing slowly, afraid to believe what was happening.
Why are we still here?
They had survived on roots and insects for weeks, and now the enemy was feeding them like honored guests. It didn't fit any version of the world they knew. Since their first days of training, every Japanese soldier had been told that Americans were brutal and merciless. Officers showed them photographs, some real, many forged, of supposed American atrocities.
It's almost too
real. They said capture meant torture, starvation, or slow execution. Death in battle, they said, was the only honorable escape. But the scene in front of them told another story. The Americans weren't monsters. They were soldiers, organized, calm, and even kind. Watanabe's mind couldn't keep up. He had expected pain, instead he found warmth. It was like watching a wall collapse inside his head, brick by brick, lie by lie. The longer he stayed in American custody, the more the illusions of Japanese propaganda crumbled. He learned that every meal came on time 3 times a day. No shouting, no cruelty, just routine and structure. He realized that the portions were larger than anything the Japanese army had ever given its men, even in good times. And it wasn't only the food the Americans kept their word. There were doctors, medicine, and rest. For the first time in months, Watanabe's body stopped shaking from hunger. For the first time in years, he slept without fear. He remembered the voices of his instructors. The Americans will starve you. They'll use you for experiments. They'll kill you slowly. Now he looked around at his fellow prisoners alive, breathing with food in their hands, and thought, were we fighting ghosts or lies? By mid-1944, many Japanese soldiers faced the same crisis of belief. Captured men began to realize that their fear had been built on deliberate terror. The Imperial Command had needed that fear to keep men fighting to make death seem noble and surrender unthinkable. The propaganda worked too well. Across the Pacific, entire units had fought until the last man. Battles ended with 95% of Japanese troops dead. The few who lived were usually too wounded or too weak to resist capture. It wasn't only about honor. It was fear engineered, rehearsed, and reinforced until it became instinct. And now that instinct was unraveling. In the clearing, Watanabe took another sip of coffee. It was bitter strong, almost too hot. He felt it burn down his throat, and for a moment he smiled. The world he had known, the one built on propaganda and obedience, was dissolving with every swallow. And in its place, something new was forming. Doubt, yes, but also understanding. For the first time, he saw that the enemy he'd been told to hate might still be human. The next days brought a rhythm that felt almost unreal. Every sunrise came with the same promise: food, water, rest, and work. No threats, no beatings, no shouts in foreign rage, just the quiet, mechanical hum of an American military system that seemed to run like clockwork. For men who had crawled out of the jungle half dead, the stability itself felt miraculous. At the camp gates, guards greeted them with calm efficiency. No hatred, no revenge. Everything had rules, schedules, and paperwork. Even captivity had order. Each morning, the prisoners lined up for breakfast rice when available, sometimes canned beef and bread when not. 3 meals a day, every day, on time. To men who had lived through chaos and starvation, that predictability was as nourishing as the food itself. Watanabe watched the guards eat the same rations. No special meals for Americans, no rotten scraps for prisoners. That equality, simple but undeniable, began to eat away at years of conditioning. If the Americans saw them as subhuman, why would they share their food? Soon came medical checkups. Doctors and nurses examined each man malaria, dysentery, beriberi infections. They treated them with supplies the Japanese army had only heard rumors about: antibiotics, quinine, real bandages.
The trench system
Within weeks, skin cleared, fevers dropped, and bones began to regain shape under new flesh. By late 1944, roughly a third of all Japanese POWs arriving in American custody needed immediate medical care. Yet survival rates exceeded 98%. The contrast was staggering in Japanese hospitals. Those same odds would have meant death for 1 in 4. Clean water flowed from taps. Latrines were organized, bathtubs available. Clothes were washed regularly. The air of decay and sickness that followed them from the jungle began to fade. The camp wasn't luxurious, it was still war, but it was efficient, almost humane in its precision. Everything had purpose: sanitation, nutrition, rest work, detail, recreation. Even the guards' behavior shocked the prisoners. They followed rules strict but fair. They addressed prisoners by number or name, not insult. And when tempers did flare, officers intervened to restore discipline, not cruelty. To Watanabe, the daily routine was both comfort and torment. Comfort because it gave him life. Torment because it forced him to realize
Here,
how
take
wrong
this.
everything he'd been told had
Try
been.
to keep warm.
Each day that passed in the camp deepened the same impossible question. If the Americans could show mercy here, what had the war really been about? He didn't know the answer. None of them did. But he knew one thing for certain: the people he had once imagined as monsters had saved his life. And in that simple, quiet truth, the foundations of his world began to change forever. As weeks turned into months, the camp became less a place of punishment and more a place of recovery. The bodies that had arrived skeletal and trembling began to change.
Next.
Hollow cheeks filled out. Color returned to pale skin. The Americans
extent of the
recorded
injury,
everything. Weight
Just a
charts,
flesh wound, Private.
medical notes, daily rations.
Clean wrap applied.
Almost like doctors restoring life to patients rather than guards overseeing prisoners.
Next.
Watanabe could feel the transformation in himself.
The data indicates
He had
a
weighed barely
significant
95
upward
pounds
trend,
when captured.
particularly
By
at
the
this
third month,
juncture.
he was past
I
125.
suppose the numbers don't lie.
His strength returned gradually, but the real change was deeper. Something invisible working
tried to blame
quietly
it on the
inside
goat.
his mind. Every day brought small moments that challenged what he believed about enemies. A Marine once handed him a cigarette without a word. Another showed him a photograph of his wife and two children back home. They were simple gestures, yet each felt like a crack of light breaking through years of darkness. For some prisoners, that light was hard to accept. They struggled to reconcile kindness with the hatred they'd been taught. Some refused to speak. Others cried in silence after meals, ashamed of their relief. Watanabe wrote about it years later. The first week I waited to be tortured. The second week I waited to be starved. By the third week I realized neither would happen. By the second month I had to face the truth. Everything we were told about Americans was false.
Repeat after me. Hello.
He wasn't alone. All around the camp, men who had been prepared to die began to rediscover the instinct to live. Some volunteered for work details beyond what was required, repairing fences, cleaning, helping with supplies.
Easy now, just a little
They
water.
said it was
You're
their
gonna be
way
all right.
of giving
We've got
back for the food and medicine that had saved them. A few even started learning English, writing down words phonetically on scraps of paper, "Thank you, water doctor" food. The guards helped them pronounce each one, amused but patient.
Yeah, that's my wife and the
Soon
kids.
they could communicate enough to
We
joke,
haven't
to
seen
ask
them in about
questions,
6
to
months
talk
now.
about baseball. Baseball became the great equalizer. On weekends, Americans and Japanese played together in dusty fields under the same sun. For a few hours, rank and allegiance disappeared. There was laughter, teasing competition, but no hatred. Even the officers noticed the change. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, one of the camp supervisors, recalled later, "Those guys worked harder than we asked them to. They volunteered for extra duties, tried to thank us in broken English." You could tell they were struggling with the idea of being grateful to people they'd been trained to hate. But that gratitude, it was real. It wasn't easy for them. In Japanese culture, surrender was the ultimate shame. To feel thankful toward one's enemy was unthinkable. But the reality was undeniable. These men had been saved not by their own army, but by the one they had been taught to despise. At night, Watanabe sometimes lay awake listening to the faint sounds of the camp, the guards talking quietly, the hum of generators, the distant rhythm of the Pacific wind. He thought about his fallen friends, about everything they'd died believing. And he whispered to himself, "We were wrong, but at least I lived long enough to know." By the time winter reached the Pacific, the men who had once expected torture were walking freely within the camp fences. They were still prisoners, but the barbed wire no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a boundary between two worlds, the world of fear they had come from and the world of reason they were slowly learning to trust. News filtered through about how Allied prisoners had suffered under Japanese control. Starvation, forced labor brutality, that claimed 1 in 4
Did you
lives.
see the look on Johnson's face?
And the
when I lit
contrast was impossible to ignore. Here in American camps, the death rate was under 2%, most from wounds suffered long before capture. That difference wasn't lost on anyone. Even the guards seemed aware of what it represented. They carried out orders firmly but fairly,
easy
following
now. Take
laws
your time.
written
You're doing
not
real
out of
good.
vengeance but out of principle. To the Americans, mercy wasn't weakness, it was discipline. As weeks passed, the camp functioned like a small city. There were kitchens serving thousands of meals a day, clinics that operated like hospitals, records that tracked every prisoner's health and letters home. It was bureaucracy mixed with compassion, organization as an expression of humanity. For the Japanese, this was a new kind of education. They saw that order could exist without cruelty, that power didn't have to mean domination. They watched Americans obey their own rules, even when no one was watching. And in that observation, the foundations of respect began to grow. Watanabe often helped in the kitchen. He noticed that the guards and prisoners ate the same portions, drank the same bitter coffee,
my little girl
sometimes
there.
even complained about the same canned
She
beef.
has your eyes.
It was
A
equality
beautiful
through
family.
rations, and it said more than any speech ever could. Some of the men, unable to express their feelings directly, began to write letters most never sent,
Glad to be
thanking
moving
the
out of here.
Americans for their care.
Ready for the next stop.
Others prayed in silence. For a few, gratitude was too heavy to carry, tangled in shame and disbelief. Still, there was something undeniable taking shape: trust. The same men who once believed capture was dishonor now saw survival as redemption. Watanabe, now strong again, often stood near the fence at sunset watching the guards rotate shifts. He thought about what his country had told him, that the Americans were beasts. But beasts didn't offer clean water medicine or life itself. He realized the truth that would stay with him for the rest of his days: mercy had survived the war. For the Americans, feeding and healing their enemies was not just policy, it was a statement. It meant civilization could exist even amid destruction, that victory didn't require abandoning one's humanity. The Japanese POWs who lived through it carried that understanding home after the war. They spoke of the rations, the doctors, the order, the fairness. Their testimonies became seeds for something far greater: Japan's willingness to accept American occupation and rebuild through partnership, not defiance. When Kenji Watanabe finally returned home, he was no longer the man who had entered the jungle. He had seen the worst of humanity and the best, and he understood a truth simple enough to endure any war. The strongest victories are not won with bullets. They are won with dignity, compassion, and the courage to treat even an enemy as a human being.
The long journey was finally at an end. For these men, the calm sea meant a return to Japan. Careful now, it's hot. Thank you, we really appreciate it. Looks delicious.
My wife, she looks older now.
Yes, we made it back.
Thank God you're safe. I missed you so much.
Welcome home.
Good to meet you. That looks wonderful.
Remember, the dove represents peace for many cultures. It's about being kind to each other and finding calm in the world.
Reconciliation is not merely an act of forgetting. It is an active process of remembering with the intent.
Saved.
All right, everyone, let's keep moving through the doors. Remember, we meet back here at 3. Bang in, bang in.
Mercy, like the tide, recedes only to return with relentless force, surviving the wreckage of war.
As you can see here, the aid workers focused first on the hospitals, understanding that public health was essential to the rebuilding effort.
You always were a terrible shot.
And you were too slow. Good times.
The River of Lights merges with the heavens above, a timeless tradition connecting earth and sky.
When you look back, you realize that mercy was the only path forward, the only way to heal. Humanity endured.